I'm Dan Kurtz-Phelan, and this is the Foreign Affairs Interview.
The velocity of information and the velocity of technology are just coming at us so quickly that I worry, the greatest danger is not the failure of technology, it's the failure to imagine how this technology can be weaponized.
It's been nearly 15 years since Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta warned of a, quote, cyber Pearl Harbor. Since then, most of us have become fairly inured to such a risk. That's true even as there's been a steady clip of cyber attacks on the United States and other countries, some of them quite alarming, and even as a new, more powerful AI model is released by an American or Chinese lab seemingly every week. Jen Easterly has spent much of the past 20 years defending American cyberspace against such threats. She has been both a military officer and a top civilian official, most recently running CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Now, Easterly warns, the danger is about to get much worse. For all the talk of AI-enabled cyber attacks and all the attention on scarily powerful models from American labs like Anthropic and OpenAI and from their Chinese counterparts, Easterly worries that we still fail to appreciate both the magnitude of the threat and the speed with which a true crisis could be approaching. I spoke to Easterly on Thursday, July 30th. Jen, thanks so much for joining me. You wrote a fantastic piece called The End of Cybersecurity shortly after you left government last year. That followed a couple of pieces that you'd published while in your last, or at least your most recent government job, running CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And so I'm eager to talk about all of those as well as a ton that has happened since.
Yeah, well, really happy to be here.
Well, let's start with the topic that tends to dominate any discussion of technology these days and that you addressed in that most recent piece. How much is AI raising the cyber threat for the United States? There have been a number of recent incidents that have, I think, brought it to the attention of the rest of us. But how do you assess that threat? And I guess to put it simply, how worried should we be?
Yeah, stepping back, it's interesting, Dan, when I wrote that piece, which I think you published in October of last year, right? The end of cybersecurity, what I sort of thought is an optimist take on how to fix the cybersecurity problem. But really, I think things have changed so radically since that period of time, and whatever that is, 9 months ago, to the point, and I don't think I could have said it then, but right now, we're at a moment where, frankly, cyber and AI are just inextricably linked. You really cannot talk about cyber defense or cybersecurity without AI. And AI is not going to be the engine of security, whether that's cybersecurity or national security, or the engine of economic prosperity or innovation, unless we know that these capabilities, which of course are very powerful, very fast moving, and as we're quick to find out, even as recent as a week ago, unpredictable, unless these capabilities are designed and developed and tested and delivered with security as the top priority. So that was sort of the thesis of the piece that I wrote. But the developments over the past, say, 3 or 4 months since the release of these very powerful models being used for cyber have only, I think, illuminated how important this moment is, particularly, for everybody who cares about security, but in particular, cyber defenders, how much opportunity there is, but also to your point about how much should we be worried? All of the real risks and the threats that are out there. And, that was certainly illuminated over the past week with this incident that happened between Hugging Face, which is, a crazy name for a company. I don't know how many of your listeners have heard of Hugging Face, but go look it up. Essentially, you can think about it as a repository, an open source repository for all sorts of AI capabilities. So what happened was that OpenAI was testing one of their new cyber capable models and looking to try and benchmark it to see how good, how capable it was. And so it gave it essentially a test, but it put it inside of what's called a sandbox or a little cage. You can think about that to make sure that it could do its work without causing any damage in the outside world. So it took down all of the putative safeguards on this capability. And then the model was trying to figure out, well, I want to get really high marks on this benchmark test. So the model figured out how to essentially escape its cage. It jumped out of the cage and it went looking for the answers to the exam. So it hacked into another company, Hugging Face, and stole the answers for the exam. Hugging Face discovered this, didn't know who the actor was. Later, OpenAI said, "Oh, it's us." But this is essentially the case of a rogue agent, a powerful model escaping its cage and hacking into another company. And it shows you one of the reasons why we need to be very concerned about these increasingly powerful models.
Were you surprised by that incident, or I suppose earlier just by the sheer capabilities that OpenAI model and also Mythos, released by Anthropic a few months ago, suddenly made all of us aware of?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could argue in some ways the article I wrote for you all kind of presaged a little bit of these capabilities. I mean, the central thesis was increasingly powerful AI is going to help solve the canonical problem that we have in cybersecurity, which really comes down to software quality. And I talked about how these models are getting more and more capable of finding and fixing vulnerabilities. Now, the downside, if you can find the vulnerabilities, you can also weaponize them. And the issue is, will you weaponize them faster than defenders are able to remediate these vulnerabilities? And so I don't think I was necessarily surprised about this happening because I think anybody who's been in this world for a while expected that there would be incidents like this. I mean, I think the good news is that this was not a hack from an adversary nation. This was actually a capability that went out of control. And the good news is OpenAI worked with Hugging Face. They did a review. We actually convened a group of chief information security officers, almost 700, working with a group called the Cloud Security Alliance. And Hugging Face was there, very transparently explaining what happened. And then we basically published something that says, what are the implications and how should security leaders, as well as executives and boards, think about this type of incident? So was I surprised? To be honest, no, but it should make us stop and be very, very mindful of how these capabilities are being developed, because I think we can say that this is the first fully autonomous attack using a cyber capability. We've seen semi-autonomous attacks over the past 6 months, but we should treat this as a watershed moment and yet another reason for us to figure out how these capabilities need to be designed and governed with security as the top priority.
I will not ask you to get too sci-fi about this, but as you worry about scenarios with that happening kind of in the wild, what are the things that would keep you up at night if you were in your old job at this moment?
Yeah, you know, at CISA, our main role as America's cyber defense agency was to protect and defend the critical infrastructure that Americans rely on every hour of every day. And you understand this well, Dan, and your audience probably does. But, you know, critical infrastructure is not some technical term. It's really about how we get clean drinking water, you know, the transportation we rely upon, how we communicate, the healthcare we rely upon, how we get our money from the ATM. It really is the services that we rely upon. And, you know, the truth at the end of the day, all of these services are built on an insecure backbone. And that's because for nearly 40 years, and this is the point I made in the piece, because of misaligned economic incentives, because of a lack of technology regulation, a lack of a software liability regime holding technology manufacturers accountable for the quality of their products, technology vendors have essentially been allowed to develop and deliver what is flawed, defective, insecure software, right? Software that prioritizes speed to market and features and convenience and driving down cost all over security. I mean, security was essentially a bolt on, right? This is what created the multi-billion dollar cybersecurity aftermarket. And so the truth is, this critical infrastructure we rely upon is inherently full of flaws and defects. We call them vulnerabilities as a technical term, but think about them as, you know, a product defect if you were driving a car with exploding airbags. for
we
example.
kind of soft pedal the or obscure the blame by using that kind of language. I
Right,
guess is the
exactly. I mean,
takeaway.
at the end of the day, that's what is the economic incentives piece. And we, wrote about this, right? That software security is kind of a quintessential, what's called a credence good. So consumers don't really understand, how do I actually know if that software is secure? I can't actually look at it and kind of figure out what the code is, like I'm looking at the matrix, right? So you assume it's secure. You don't actually make demands of vendors. And so vendors are not really incentivized to prioritize security. That's why it's always been a bolt on. If you go back to the early days of the creation of the internet, some of the giants like Vint Cerf, who created the TCP/IP protocol, right? They will tell you security was not a feature that was a main focus area. It was about things like, reliability and how do I efficiently use this capability. We weren't thinking about ransomware back then, or attacks from nation states, or the fact that, this latest news about Iranians potentially going after our water systems in the state of Minnesota. We weren't thinking about Salt Typhoon or Volt Typhoon, the Chinese intelligence services or the Chinese military going after our most critical infrastructure. And so, to your question, I was very worried about this when I was the director of CISA, and I'm equally worried about it now, because what's fundamentally changed, Dan, I talked about these vulnerabilities. Like, what was the good news back in the let's call it Mythos days, was the fact that to be able to identify and discover those flaws and defects, and then to exploit them, essentially use them as hacks, to weaponize them, to break into a system, that was actually constrained. It was constrained by expertise and skill. It was constrained by time and attention and resources. So, it used to be days, weeks, months before a vulnerability could actually be weaponized. That, because of these increasingly powerful AI tools, that timeline has been radically compressed. So the timeline between discovering a vulnerability and the ability to weaponize it is now in hours and days. And that will likely be compressed even more. And frankly, that changes kind of everything we've been doing in cybersecurity and cyber defense over the past many years.
Can you explain what it would mean to weaponize a vulnerability in a water system or a hospital system or, transportation infrastructure or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, you can think about real examples of it. Let's go back to 2017 in something famously called WannaCry, where there was a vulnerability in a piece of, I think it was Microsoft software, that the North Koreans were essentially able to take advantage of this flaw in the code and deploy ransomware that affected many of the computer systems and servers in the National Health Service. Right? I think tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of these servers. And so that really had a big impact on access to healthcare. Right. And, even this latest water systems in Minnesota, which has been in the news, it looks like there was an ability to affect what's called the operational technology systems, the systems that can control how water is essentially controlled by a water utility. And so if you have an ability to leverage the insecurities or the flaws in code to take them over, whether it's for disruption, ultimately, if an adversary wanted to destroy a capability and prevent having access to a water system or a power grid or a transportation system, or being able to do anything in a hospital, that's what, I worry about the most. And then certainly ransomware, which is now a multi-trillion-dollar business, that is of great concern, because if you're able to deploy ransomware on a not very well-resourced rural hospital, which doesn't have all of the cybersecurity capabilities and systems that major hospitals might have, if you're able to hit a small water utility, this disruption in services has a real effect on people's psychology. I mean, going back to what I mentioned with Volt Typhoon, this was probably, Dan, the most bracing moment of my time as director of CISA. I remember, and this is all public now, but I remember my team meeting me in our secret compartmented facility. Again, but this is before it went public, to tell me that we had discovered that hackers from the Chinese People's Liberation Army had burrowed deep inside our most sensitive critical infrastructure. So these were water utilities, power systems, communication systems, transportation systems. And the crazy thing was, this wasn't the Chinese playbook that we had been looking at for decades, right? We've always talked about, the incredible transfer of intellectual property and data theft. This was about embedding cyber bombs, you can think about them, in our critical infrastructure so that China could launch disruptive attacks in the event of a crisis in Taiwan. So think about this. A war in Asia is accompanied by mass disruption in the US, everything, everywhere, all at once, specifically to, and this is their doctrine, incite societal chaos and panic, and to deter the US from being able to marshal military might and citizen will in the defense of our allies in Asia. A very purposeful strategy to cause disruption. And these are the things that we were talking about and worrying about before AI became the daily headline. And so these problems are even more urgent now. And I hate to say this because I tend to be an eternal optimist, and the article I wrote took a very optimistic view. But my fear is because we've not been able to get the governance right, we don't have the guardrails, we don't have the regulations, and these capabilities are moving so fast. My worry is we are going to see a very significant event that has real world impacts on our critical infrastructure, likely within the next 4 to 6 months. And that, frankly, we have to meet that head on. We have to not suffer a failure of imagination. I'm very mindful of that as we go into the 25th anniversary of 9/11. We have to imagine that scenario, we have to embrace it, and we have to prepare for it so that we can build the necessary resilience to these attacks to be able to defend the American people and reduce risk to the services we rely upon every day.
What would you be doing to prepare if you, again, were back in that old job?
Well, there are a lot of things that I would be doing. I think one of the things that's really important, going back to this whole, hopefully not too technical discussion on vulnerabilities, but really at the end of the day, vulnerabilities are what leads to breaches and hacks. So CISA played a role where it was essentially the government center of gravity in understanding these vulnerabilities so that we can get this information out and to protect critical infrastructure. So we played that role when there were major open source vulnerabilities. We played that role around the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where we were very worried about Russian retaliatory attacks on US critical infrastructure. We played that role when we discovered China going after both our critical infrastructure through the PLA, but also the Salt Typhoon attacks against our telcos, essentially to steal sensitive data. So this time is really what CISA was built for, was to help protect and defend critical infrastructure. So, I'd be very focused on working with across the US government, but working very closely with the private sector, all of the critical infrastructure sectors, and then working with our international partners, because at the end of the day, these threats don't know borders. And it's really important that we work together so that we can share the visibility into the threat environment and do everything we can to be able to reduce risk to the nation. And so that's what I believe the current government is focused on trying to do. CISA has lost a lot of its capability and capacity, but I know it's doing what it can to work with the private sector, again, to try and reduce risk from these increasingly powerful capabilities. The other thing I'd be doing, I guess two other things. In the 2024 timeframe, we stood up something called the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, the JCDC.ai. And we brought together critical infrastructure entities, the frontier AI labs, the technology companies, the cybersecurity companies. And one of the things that we did was we actually created a playbook on how to deal with a major incident. very much like the Hugging Face OpenAI incident. And so very, very important to practice kind of the exercise against what a major incident might look like. And so I think iteratively doing things like that, that would be another very important thing. And then the other thing I would really be doing was picking up the mantle of what I did when I was at CISA, and that is advocating for some of the things that I wrote about in the piece. For example, a software liability regime, right? These capabilities, from an optimist point of view, will be able to do amazing, amazing things. And, in many ways, if we're able to secure them, they will end cybersecurity as we know it. They will find and fix those flaws and defects and vulnerabilities in the software that we rely upon. They will lead towards much more secure software, right? We'll be in a world where, we drive cars and cars have issues every once in a while and they're bad drivers. But fundamentally, since the time when Ralph Nader wrote Unsafe at Any Speed, automobiles are much safer. Planes are much safer. That's the world that we want to get to in software and critical infrastructure. That's the optimist case, but it's all predicated on making sure that the labs that create these capabilities have to focus on security as the top priority, not a bolt-on, not an afterthought, but the top priority.
There's a lot I want to pick up on there, but I think it's probably just worth saying a little bit more about CISA now. You put it quite delicately when you said that it had lost capabilities. I think other people would say that it's been kneecapped by the Trump administration, not because of anger at you or dissatisfaction with its work, but because of resentment over your predecessor in the first Trump administration, Chris Krebs, who had said that the 2020 election was secure. How woeful a state is CISA in, and how much does that, as well as other changes the administration made, leave us more vulnerable or less able to address the vulnerabilities that you talked about?
CISA, when I became the director in 2021, was actually the newest agency in the federal government. So it's a pretty new entity. It was stood up wisely in the first Trump administration in November of 2018 to fill two roles, really to serve as America's civilian cyber defense agency and the national coordinator for critical infrastructure resilience and security. So the idea was CISA played the lead role in understanding, managing, and reducing risk to critical infrastructure. And CISA was not a regulatory agency, didn't collect intel, didn't do law enforcement. It was really all about working by, with, and through partners to catalyze an understanding of the threat environment, and then through technical expertise, reduce risk to that infrastructure. And we built, with the support of a very bipartisan Congress in the early days, with authorities that we got through the bipartisan Cyberspace Solarium Commission. There were many laws that came out of the NDAA 2021 that really helped to build this cyber capacity. So we were almost 4,000 full-time employees when I left. And I think we had built some really valuable collaborative relationships across the board that helped reduce risk, whether it was to nation-state adversaries or cyber criminals. And so what I would say, Dan, is America has never needed a strong, capable, high-capacity, high-capability cyber defense agency more than it does right now. And from what I'm reading in the current press, the Congress is now recognizing that some of the actions taken over the past 18 months are very detrimental to the safety and security of the American people. And I know there's a big push to make sure that CISA has the talent and the authorities to be able to do that. But look, at the end of the day, you're right. I think a lot of the negative attitudes by this administration go back to 2020, when my predecessor accurately noted that the election was secure. This is something I looked at very closely. And yes, 2020 and 2022 and 2024 were secure elections. There's no evidence that a malicious actor changed, altered, or deleted a vote or had any impact on election security. But look, I am a non-political person. I'm a lifelong independent. I'm somebody who's focused on security, and cybersecurity has to be, and certainly this is the way I treated it, a non-political, nonpartisan endeavor. And even as we had the what's called the lead government role for election infrastructure security, we had fantastic relationships with, red states, blue states, working with the secretaries of state, because the secretaries of state, who are the chief election officials in most cases, nobody wants to run a fraudulent election. Everybody wants to have the technical resources that we provided, both cyber and physical, to make sure that their infrastructure was safe and secure. So I was very proud on the morning after the presidential election in November of 2024 to put out the statement that said, this election was safe and secure. And it wasn't because, Dan, it was quote unquote too big to rig. It was because the infrastructure was in fact not compromised. We had no evidence of any compromise that had any type of an impact on the election. Look, it's really important to understand that the infrastructure that we use, the systems that we use to vote, they're not connected to the internet. It's very hard to hack something that's not connected to the internet. It's one of the reasons we need to be very thoughtful about some of these new AI systems and really make sure that they are in fact contained. And that's why the guardrails that OpenAI is going back to look on to make sure that these systems cannot do things like jump into completely air-gapped, non-internet connected systems. It's sort of one. So very hard to hack something that is completely disconnected. Two, I think the number is probably almost 98% of voting records are paper. Very hard to hack paper, right? And three, there are multiple layers of cyber and physical controls in place to protect election infrastructure. So even if there is a vulnerability, which there's vulnerabilities in all systems, there are multiple layers to protect that vulnerability from being hacked, exploited, or weaponized. The last thing is, if you talk to any election official, if you've seen one state's election, you've seen one state's election. Every jurisdiction does it a little differently, and that actually creates incredible resilience because you don't have all of these things connected. So it's very, very hard to do anything that lands at scale, which is why I can say with fidelity that, in fact, those elections that, I certainly observed or was part of was, in fact, secure.
How worried are you as we head towards the midterms in a few months and then obviously the 2028 presidential election? You wrote a piece when you were head of CISA, which addressed both cyber risks that you were just talking about, but as well as kind of AI-enabled disinformation. The capabilities a few years ago when you wrote that look like nothing compared to where they are now. How bad are those threats as we head towards these elections?
If I'm remembering that piece, the TLDR is basically like, we don't need to be that concerned about AI having any impact on the 2024 election, but we will likely need to be concerned about future elections. And to your point, Dan, these capabilities have advanced so fast in such a short period of time. We should be very thoughtful to the question that you're asking. Now, for the reasons that I talked about, the resilience of election infrastructure, the fact that it's not connected to the internet, the fact that you have paper, the multiple levels of physical and technical controls, all of that still holds, frankly. What I think is the most worrying is not actual technical hacks, but perception hacks, because we live in an environment, an information environment that is so fragmented that it doesn't necessarily matter whether something is true. It matters whether it goes viral. And so I think at the end of the day, the people who have to actually certify those votes, those chief election officials whose responsibility it is to run safe and secure elections, I think they're going to do everything they can to make sure that their voters have confidence. And so there will be, I think, a pretty messy information environment out there, but we'll have to look towards the states because it is by the Constitution, their job, not the federal government's job, to run elections. I have great faith and confidence having worked with chief election officials across the country. So it will be up to them and the governors to make sure that when those elections happen, and I believe they will be safe and secure, that the final messages that come out about who won those elections, that voters can have fidelity in those results and can believe that their votes were counted as cast.
We'll return to my conversation with Jen Easterly after a short break. You talked earlier about the change in Chinese doctrine that you witnessed and came to understand grappling with the Salt Typhoon attacks a few years ago. As you look at Chinese AI-enabled cyber capabilities, how do they compare to ours? I mean, there are obviously Chinese models that are perhaps a few months behind Mythos, but how do you assess those capabilities, and what should we be doing to prepare for the threat from Chinese models, which we have obviously less ability to control?
Yeah, I think this is another, again, if I wasn't so worried about everything, I would just like, it's also so exciting and so fascinating, right? I mean, I often say, like, this is the most exciting time to be alive and to be in my field. But, the stakes are obviously really, really high as well. And so, one of the things that happened with this Hugging Face OpenAI incident, I don't want to nerd out on you too much, but when Hugging Face realized that they had been, quote unquote, breached, they tried to use a model. I think they were trying to use Anthropic to do what's called the IR, the incident response, to help them identify what happened and to clean up the situation. And the model they tried to use essentially thought that they were malicious, a malicious actor, and shut them down from using it. And so what did they do? They went to use a Chinese open weights model, GLM 5.2, that did a good job. So,
And open weights means that you can manipulate it more than you could with a closed, yeah.
well, yeah, you can download the model and use it, right? And you can see that the Chinese open weights model, again, these are models that can be downloaded and they can be modified. That's the security issues around them. But they're much cheaper, right? So you can download them and use them. And frankly, they're becoming better and better and more capable. So the latest models I mentioned, GLM 5.2, I think that comes from Z.ai. Then Moonshot AI, people will probably have heard of something called Kimi K3. There are all these Kimi versions. Look, if you don't have the money to spend on some of these more expensive models, you may want to access some of these Chinese models. Now, you might be saying, Jen, you're crazy. Like, aren't you telling us about all these threats from China? And yes, I think it's a legitimate concern, but you can download these models, so you're not connecting in any way to China. So, are there concerns about, has China put some sort of a capability like a backdoor, or, could China somehow put a control in there that can affect how you're able to use this capability? So I think just as you would want to rigorously test anything that you didn't completely trust, yes, you would want to do that. But in many cases, if they're cheaper, if you don't have a huge risk in terms of how you're using them, well, you may want to tap into those models. And so this is this huge issue that's going on right now, whether in fact, the US government, there's been a little bit of chatter about, will the US government somehow put controls preventing access to Chinese open weights models? There was a letter signed, I think, by NVIDIA and many of the big companies saying we need to continue to have access to open weights models and how important they are to have both an open and closed system. And I strongly believe we need to have access to open weights models. There may be very good reason to tap into certain types of the closed models from OpenAI and Anthropic. But I think a thriving technology ecosystem is one in which there is greater competition. And that competition will hopefully push people to ensure that these models are not only very capable to task, but that they are as secure as possible. And if you look at how China is approaching these models versus kind of how the US in a more ad hoc way in terms of how you do the policy, right? They put in place the executive order that had voluntary testing. There's some talk about, I think they're going to release a framework for this testing. There's a vulnerability gold eagle capability that Treasury is running to bring together critical infrastructure to identify and remediate vulnerabilities. But look at what China is doing. If folks are following, they just had this World AI conference that just concluded, and there were a couple really interesting things from it that were very specifically focused on AI safety. President Xi was there for the first time. He attended in person, and he gave a speech that was particularly like safety forward. And they did this official conference statement that was very much focused around cybersecurity risks. And then they just released this information about, I guess they call it WACO, the World AI Cooperation Organization, the first intergovernmental body dedicated to AI. But the fact that you had President Xi specifically talking about the importance of safety and security, the worry about loss of control, the worry about cybersecurity capabilities, I actually think we should sort of pause on that and recognize that we want to make sure that our population is safe and secure. Even though China has greater threshold for pain, I think ultimately they want to make sure that their population, their economy, their place is secure. And so this is why I think one of the most important things that has to happen over the next 6 months is the US and China have to come together and have very serious discussions about how to ensure the safety and security of these increasingly powerful tools, not just because of the cyber implications, but because of the implications for bioweapons or chemical weapons, the full range of concerns around that, the loss of control. Look, we were able to do this in the nuclear world. It's a little bit different now because, of course, nuclear weapons were built and safeguarded by governments that were disincentivized to use them. These capabilities are largely built by private companies that are incentivized for returns to their investors and profit motives. But it is the responsibility of governments to protect their people. And so we have to have these discussions and we have to figure out how to put the right guardrails around these capabilities so that these very, very powerful, magical tools are able to serve humanity in powerful and positive ways and not do irreparable harm.
Why should we think it's possible for those serious discussions to happen? I think there's been some agreement on at least starting to have them in both the Biden-Xi summit and the more recent Trump-Xi summits. But the reports on those do not suggest that they've really gotten to the heart of the matter or grappled with the toughest issues. Do you think that there is, in fact, scope, given the kind of shared existential risks, despite the competitive dynamics, to really get something done?
Look, hope is not a strategy, but we have been able to do hard things, right? In the Obama administration, there was an agreement that was done, as you well know, with the Iranians on the nuclear issues, right? So we've done hard things before. We've been able to put a nuclear test regime in place, controlling AI, putting safeguards in place, having testing regimes. None of this is against the laws of physics. These are not impossible things. These are a matter of incentives and will. And I think from reading in the press, there is moves afoot led by the Treasury Secretary to have these discussions about AI safety in the lead up to the summit, the upcoming Xi summit, if it in fact happens in September. I was very pleased to see that. And I can only imagine that this incident of the past week will further sort of motivate these types of discussions. So could it all fall wildly apart? 100%, right? Could we start to edge towards a place where we make sure that these capabilities protect our population? We certainly got to try.
How do you think about other actors beyond the US and China? I think some of the concern here is that, China is, by the standards of some of its other partners, a relatively, has low risk tolerance, wants stability, worries about the proliferation of some of these tools. That probably isn't true to the same extent with Russia or with North Korea, let alone with terrorist groups or, financial criminals or anything else. How do you think about that dimension of it, given how easy, especially with open weight models, as you noted, it is for some of those actors to turn these into pretty powerful weapons in a way that you just could not with nukes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly the question. That's the incentive, right? The US doesn't want, China doesn't want these capabilities falling in the hands of, let's just set aside the other nation states for a sec, falling in the hands of cyber criminals, worst case terrorists. I know we don't spend a lot of time talking about global terrorism. Having served for 21 years in uniform, having been in Iraq twice and Afghanistan, and, served much of that time after 9/11, I am very, very mindful of a world where terrorists can get a hold of these types of capabilities and wreak enormous havoc. One of the stories that I tell that always sticks in the back of my mind, I work for Condi Rice after 9/11, so was there in the White House from '02 to '04. One of the last things I did before I went off to the National Security Agency at Fort Meade, I went with her as she testified before the 9/11 Commission. And you remember, I mean, that's one of the best books out there on national security, terrorism, and threats. And, the big takeaway from that book, from the hearings, I think was, the famous quote, which is on that September day, we were unprepared. We did not grasp the magnitude of a threat that had been growing for some considerable period of time, a failure of policing, a failure of management, a failure of capability, but above all, a failure of imagination. Right. And here we are almost 25 years from 9/11, and the velocity of information and the velocity of technology are just coming at us so quickly that I worry, the greatest danger is not the failure of technology, it's the failure to imagine how this technology can be weaponized. So, the second quick story I'll tell is when I was the commander of the Army's cyber battalion, we had gotten this information that Al Qaeda was going to publish its first English language magazine called Inspire. Very slick little magazine. You might remember it was from the 2010 timeframe. Remember that? And there was a page in this magazine. It was called How to Make a Bomb in the Kitchen of Your Mom. And it was literally a step-by-step recipe of instructions on how to build a homemade bomb. When I was in Iraq, we dealt with these things called improvised explosive devices from, Iraq, and then even Iran back then, these explosively formed penetrators having, killing thousands and thousands of Iraqi civilians and our troops. But we were very worried that this was going to then lead to lone wolf terrorist attacks in the West. And we tried to figure out, was there a way we could prevent this thing from getting out? And we really, really worried about it. And ultimately, there was nothing we could do. It got out. And we really held our breaths, Dan. It was literally like weeks or hours and days and weeks and months. And, we kind of thought we dodged a bullet. But then 3 years later, two brothers in Boston, Tamerlan and Joe Karzarnaya, used that exact same Inspire magazine, that exact same recipe, how to make a bomb in the kitchen of your mom, to build the pressure cooker bombs they left at the Boston Marathon. And that killed, of course, 3 people, including an 8-year-old boy, and maimed and wounded hundreds and hundreds of others. And my point is, just think about, that's so simple, right? A page in a magazine, step-by-step instructions. Now think about what AI can do. Think about that. AI generated recipes, precision imagery, auto-generated shopping lists, now available when people can say, well, you can go to the library or you can research this. Anybody that works with these tools knows how easy it is to be able to access information. Just imagine being able to access this type of information to create cyber weapons, chemical weapons, even crude versions of bioweapons. That's something we don't want to think about because it's a horrible, frightening thing. But at the end of the day, we have to be able to imagine and embrace both the best of what's possible, but the worst of what's possible, to make sure that we're planning for it, we're preparing for it so we can respond, we can recover. And frankly, so we can build the necessary resilience to be able to protect the American people on the worst case scenario. But we need to do everything we can to get ahead of that worst case scenario. And we have maybe months, Dan, to get ahead of that. And that's why I think it's so important to have these conversations, both across the business community, but to ensure that the business community and the technology community are connected in to governments who are there to be able to put the right guardrails in place to protect their people.
It was striking how much the Trump administration's policy on AI changed as soon as Mythos was released, going from the kind of, deregulate everything and let it rip, I think was the phrase that someone in the administration used, to something that looks, at least to my inexpert eyes, not that different from what the Biden administration would have been doing. Do you think that U.S. policy is at least directionally where it should be at this point?
I understand the enthusiasm why folks would say, well, let's go on this technology. I think there's a bit of a failure of imagination in terms of, only thinking about the incredible magical things they can do, but not being willing to think about all of the downsides. I think there's a little bit of the idea that we've had, frankly, for years and years. I mean, this is really kind of the cultural ethos that have brought us so many good things, but moving fast and breaking things has also resulted in a lot of breakage, Dan, right? It's why you have an internet full of malware, why you have software full of vulnerabilities, why you have social media full of disinformation. And as been discovered, now we are racing, and that's the word that's used, right? Racing to build and operationalize the most consequential technology of our lifetime. And so I think now that we can actually imagine what the worst is when Mythos came out, followed on by ChatGPT 5.5 Cyber, and now some of the Chinese models that are getting equally capable. I think the government has recognized some of the damage that could be done. First and foremost, it was really about the global financial ecosystem, which can not only be impacted technically, but also from a confidence level perspective, right? And so that was, I think, the first wake-up call that led to the executive order of early June. Now, there's a word in that executive order, which is voluntary. And I understand that there is this tension between, well, if you start putting significant safety regulations in place, that could then crush the innovative spirit that really makes American technology what it is. And so I understand the trade-off that people are grappling with. But at the end of the day, I think the government's fundamental job is to protect the American people. And being willing to be very open, again, to the good, but also the bad. I think the bad leaves you in a place where you can't really do much in a sustainable way through executive orders. So the administration is taking certain steps. Should they take more fulsome steps that are not necessarily voluntary? You could argue that the Biden administration may be over-rotated by trying to find this novel Defense Production Act capability in their 80-page executive order. You could argue like both, something in the middle might be a little bit better. But Dan, at the end of the day, executive orders only go so far. You can get rid of the whole thing when a new president comes in. What we need is the United States Congress to legislate. They need to create legislation that will actually put guardrails around the most dangerous capabilities. And again, this is not against the law of physics. This is actually happening at the state level. If you look at California, you look at New York, you look at Illinois' latest legislation, they're actually, no, it's hard to get right? It's really hard to get this right. But they're pretty good in terms of a roadmap, a framework for how at the federal level, you could look at creating something that would, again, enable us to leverage these capabilities in very powerful and positive ways, but mitigate their most serious and damaging harms to the American people. And so the administration is doing what the administration is going to do. What we need is the United States Congress to actively legislate.
One more worst case scenario I want to make sure we get your thoughts on.
Wow, we haven't talked about enough worst case scenarios.
That's right. One more. Quantum computing. There's this fear that once quantum reaches a point, all of a sudden, all of this looks much worse. When I first heard the phrase "harvest now, decrypt later," the idea that the Chinese government and others might be just sweeping up all of our files, which they can't decrypt now, but someday they'll be able to once quantum capabilities reach a certain point, is a chilling thought. How do you assess that threat, and what should we be doing to prepare for it?
Yeah, I think that part of the good news here is this is not an intractable problem. We did a lot of work on this when I was at CISA, along with the technical experts at NIST in the Commerce Department, and then at the NSA, and they work with the private sector to create algorithms that were quantum safe, right? So there is actually a way to safeguard your infrastructure, put quantum safe encryption in place to safeguard against what's called a cryptographically relevant quantum computer, right? The quantum computer where, if you can think about the matrix, where all the secrets are all revealed and traditional encryption is all broken. Will that necessarily solve the harvest and decrypt issue that you just pointed out? No, but it will allow us going forward to protect the safety and security of the current infrastructure. So, one of the most important things that critical infrastructure entities need to do now is to start making that transition to quantum safe encryption. And again, these algorithms exist. The issue is, like, it takes time and resources. And so you have to have a roadmap and plan. You have to identify those crown jewels, and then you have to start the transition. But again, it's not an intractable problem. It's just a time-consuming and expensive problem. But it's one of the most important things that big critical infrastructure companies need to do. And the good news is, like, people are asking that question. 2-3 years ago, I don't think anybody was asking that question, Dan. And so companies recognize what they need to do, and they're starting to put in place. I think Microsoft just came out and noted that the move towards quantum safe encryption, they're actually calling 2029 of when they need to transition. And so, that's less than 5 years from now. So we really need to look at a compressed timeline. And, anybody, again, in this administration, there's been a lot of focus on post-quantum cryptography. I think it's one of these issues that, again, it's not a political issue. It's not a partisan issue. It's a technical issue of protecting the American people and the critical infrastructure we rely upon every hour of every day. So some still really good work going on at NSA and at NIST, if folks want to take a look at that as a roadmap for transition.
This may fall into the category of good news. I'm not totally sure. You spent time when you were in the Army helping set up Cyber Command. You worked on cyber issues and cryptography issues in Iraq and Afghanistan. We don't often talk about our own offensive capabilities. I assume those are as good or better than any we are worried about coming from other governments or militaries. How does offense fit into this picture? What role should it have? Do you see kind of evolution that should be underway right now when it comes to our own offensive capabilities, whether that's from the military or NSA or other agencies?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks for asking. I've been lucky and privileged to have so many great opportunities throughout, a career that has spanned a bunch of different things. But one of the funnest and coolest and most rewarding and most challenging was working with a small handful of people to set up U.S. Cyber Command. This was in the 2008, 2009 timeframe in the wake of something that was called Operation Buckshot Yankee, which was Russia going after classified military networks. It was a watershed moment because it was another one of those, like, why didn't we think about this? And that then led to Secretary Gates at the time telling my boss, General Alexander, who was the director of NSA, we need to actually set up a capability both to defend military networks from significant nation-state threats, as well as to be able to project power in cyberspace, that offensive cyber. And that's one of the reasons why, very uniquely, Cyber Command, the commander of Cyber Command, is dual-hatted as the director of NSA, because the idea is you needed to set up this capability on top of the cryptologic enterprise, because understanding those vulnerabilities, right, the foreign intelligence aspect of how do I identify those flaws and defects in our adversaries, gives me the ability to then take advantage of those adversaries for offensive operations. And, we set up in 2009 or I guess 2010 final operational capability, and it evolved a little bit in fits and starts, but I think it's a really good news story to look at the capability and capacity of Cyber Command now. And I've been really, really proud to see the talent, the resources that they've been able to bring to bear. You've heard about things in Iran, heard about things in Venezuela. There are things I'm sure that we haven't heard about. But it's great to see the capability flourish in a way that we envisioned, and to be another tool in the toolbox for protecting the American people.
Is our offensive doctrine similar to China's at this point? How do we think about those in similar ways? Is there kind of certain kind of balance there?
I think the one distinction that we could probably make between the US and China is we typically will look at civilian infrastructure different from military infrastructure. And I think China does not take that view, which is why when we talked about those cyber bombs in our water systems, our power systems, our transportation and communication systems, I don't think China really focuses on whether they serve civilian populations or military populations. I think that is one major thing that we've looked at differently because of all the human rights and the laws of war implications. Now, at the end of the day, if China is willing to hold our most important critical infrastructure at risk, I think we need to be very thoughtful of all of the things we need to do, cyber being one of them, right? Cyber is a tool. It's, part of the domains of warfare. But I think probably this administration is relooking how we need to approach holding our adversaries at risk in the same way that they're holding us at risk.
Well, Jen, I feel like we'll have to maybe do another one of these in 3 or 6 months when we see how well or not the United States and others have done preparing for all of the threats that you have helped us imagine in full color. I appreciate that and appreciate the fact that you made it all so clear. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks so much. So great to see you. Appreciate the convo.
Thank you for listening. You can find the articles that we discussed on today's show at foreignaffairs.com. This episode of the Foreign Affairs Interview was produced by Ben Metzner and Kanish Tharoor. Our audio engineer is Todd Yeager. Original music is by Robin Hilton. Special thanks as well to Arena Hogan. Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you like what you heard, please take a minute to rate and review it. We release a new show every Thursday. Thanks again for tuning in.